The night was supposed to be filled with joy, but instead, it shattered into heartbreak. Emily cradled her newborn baby girl in trembling arms while her husband stormed out, slamming the door so hard the walls shook. The tiny infant had let out her first wail, a cry of life, but for him, it was too much. He muttered about sleepless nights, about burdens he never signed up for, and before Emily could even stop him, he was gone. The silence that followed was heavier than any noise, leaving her breathless. She pressed her cheek to her daughter's soft head, tears streaming, whispering promises she wasn't sure how she would keep. Alone, abandoned, and unsure of tomorrow, Emily knew she had to be strong, even as her heart crumbled. Days blurred into nights as Emily tried to adjust to single motherhood. Her body ached from childbirth, her spirit from betrayal, but her daughter's tiny hands clinging to her finger kept her moving. She had little money left, only what was hidden in an old biscuit tin, and no family to turn to. Friends had whispered sympathy, but none stayed long. The house felt like a prison of echoes, filled with the memory of a man who had promised forever but left at the first cry of responsibility. Emily rocked her baby endlessly, humming lullabies through her tears, determined that this little girl would never feel unwanted. But deep inside, she wondered how much longer she could keep going before the weight consumed her. One evening, when the cupboards were bare and her baby's hunger cries pierced the night, Emily wrapped her daughter in a faded quilt and walked into town. She stopped at the small general store, embarrassed as she asked for credit to buy milk and bread. The shopkeeper gave her a pitying look but shook his head, reminding her of the debts already unpaid. Humiliated, she walked out, clutching her baby closer, trying not to cry in front of strangers. It was then that she noticed him, a tall, broad-shouldered man loading supplies into his wagon. He had the quiet strength of someone used to solitude, his hat pulled low, his face unreadable. She recognized him vaguely as the silent rancher who lived on the outskirts, a man who rarely spoke but was known for his honesty and hard work. The rancher's name was Luke, though few called it aloud. Emily lowered her eyes, hoping he hadn't noticed her shame. But as her baby cried again, he looked over, his gaze lingering not with judgment, but something softer, an unspoken understanding. He walked toward her without hurry, his boots steady against the dusty street. Emily's heart raced as he stopped a few feet away, his eyes briefly flicking to the child in her arms. "She hungry?" he asked simply, his voice deep, calm, and surprisingly gentle. Emily nodded, too choked up to answer properly. Without another word, Luke reached into his sack, pulled out a small bottle of milk, and handed it to her. That one simple act made Emily's eyes brim with tears she couldn't hold back. Luke didn't offer comfort in words, but in actions. He waited patiently as Emily fed her baby, standing a respectful distance yet close enough to shield her from curious onlookers. When the infant quieted, he spoke again, asking if she needed a ride home. Pride made Emily hesitate, but exhaustion won. She climbed onto his wagon, clutching her baby, as the horses trotted slowly toward her rundown cottage. The ride was quiet except for the baby's occasional whimper, but it wasn't uncomfortable. There was something about Luke's silence that felt steady, dependable, and safe. For the first time in weeks, Emily didn't feel entirely alone. She didn't know why this man had stopped for her, but she felt it wasn't pity, it was something deeper, though unspoken. When they reached her small home, Luke glanced at the broken fence, the sagging roof, and the weary look in Emily's eyes. He didn't comment, only helped her down gently, careful not to jostle the baby. "You need help," he said quietly, almost like a fact, not a question. Emily bristled at first, ready to defend herself, but his tone wasn't condescending, it was sincere. She admitted softly that she had no one else, her voice breaking on the words. Luke nodded once, as though he'd already decided something. "I'll bring feed tomorrow," he said, tipping his hat before climbing back onto his wagon. Emily stood there stunned, the baby resting against her, unsure why a man who owed her nothing was offering so much. True to his word, Luke returned the next morning, his wagon filled with hay, food supplies, and even a small crib he had built with his own hands. Emily was overwhelmed, stammering that she couldn't repay him. He shook his head and set the crib inside her home, his hands skilled and steady. Over the following weeks, he came by often, not imposing, not intruding, but helping in quiet ways. He fixed the fence, patched the roof, and left baskets of vegetables by her door. Each time, Emily tried to thank him, but words seemed too small. Slowly, she began to notice the way he looked at her daughter, not with pity, but with warmth, as if the little girl's cries were a melody instead of a burden. It softened something inside her, a hope she thought had died. Despite his kindness, whispers began in town. People talked of how Emily had been abandoned, how Luke the silent rancher was suddenly always around her place. Some were cruel, suggesting she had trapped him, others questioning his motives. Emily heard the gossip and feared it would ruin what little safety she had found. One evening, she tried to tell Luke he didn't need to come anymore, that people were talking. He stood quietly, then finally said, "Let them talk. A man's worth ain't measured by whispers." His words, few as they were, carried a weight that silenced her doubts. He wasn't there because of what people thought. He was there because he chose to be. Still, Emily struggled with trust. Her husband's betrayal haunted her, making it hard to believe in kindness without cost. Late at night, while her baby slept, she wrestled with her fears. Could she truly depend on Luke, or would he one day walk away too? But each dawn, when he arrived with a steady nod and a helping hand, those fears weakened. Luke never asked for more than her acceptance of his help. He never pushed, never pried, never crossed a line. Instead, he gave her space, letting her heal in her own time, while proving through his actions that he wasn't going anywhere. One afternoon, Emily found herself laughing, truly laughing, for the first time since before the baby was born. Her daughter had managed to tip over a small bucket of water, splashing them both, and Luke, watching silently, allowed the faintest smile to tug at his lips. That tiny smile, rare and genuine, was enough to make Emily's heart stutter. She realized then how much his presence had changed her life. The house no longer felt like a cage but a home. The days were no longer endless struggles but filled with moments of unexpected peace. And in her daughter's bright eyes, she saw not loss, but a future where love could bloom again. But love was not without its trials. That winter, sickness swept through the town, and Emily's baby caught a fever. Panic consumed her as the child's cries weakened, her tiny body burning with heat. Emily sat through sleepless nights, desperate and terrified, praying she wouldn't lose the one soul who kept her going. Luke stayed by her side, fetching medicine, sitting quietly in the corner, his eyes never leaving them. When Emily wept in exhaustion, Luke held the baby gently, rocking her with surprising tenderness until she slept. It was then that Emily realized, he already loved this child as his own, even without saying the words. The fever broke after days of torment, leaving the baby weak but alive. Relief washed over Emily like a flood, and in that moment, she understood that she could no longer deny the truth. Luke wasn't just helping out of duty or kindness. He was there because he cared, deeply, for both of them. When she tried to thank him, her voice cracked, unable to express the gratitude filling her soul. He looked at her steadily and said simply, "She's family now. So are you." Those words pierced through her fears, replacing them with a warmth she hadn't felt in years. He didn't just want to help, he wanted to stay. In the spring, Luke surprised Emily by asking her to walk with him across his ranch. The land stretched wide and golden, dotted with cattle and bordered by mountains in the distance. He showed her the small house he had built with his own hands, quiet and strong, just like him. Then, in his simple, straightforward way, he asked her if she would let him give her and the baby his name. Emily's heart raced, tears welling in her eyes. She thought of the man who had abandoned them, of the nights she had felt worthless and unwanted. And then she looked at Luke, this silent rancher who had carried them through storms without asking for anything in return. With trembling hands, she said yes. Their wedding was small, just a handful of townsfolk, but it was filled with warmth. Emily wore a simple dress, her baby girl resting in her arms, while Luke stood tall and steady beside her. When the vows were spoken, they weren't elaborate or poetic, but true. Luke promised to protect them, to stay, to be a father and a husband in every way that mattered. And Emily, her voice breaking with emotion, promised to trust him, to let him love her, to build a new life together. As the ceremony ended, Luke took the baby gently into his arms, and for the first time, she smiled up at him as if she understood, this was her father now. The months that followed were not without hardship, but they faced everything together. The baby grew stronger, her laughter filling the ranch with joy. Emily learned the rhythms of ranch life, and Luke taught her with patience, never once making her feel less. Their bond deepened not through grand gestures but through the everyday moments, shared meals, quiet evenings by the fire, and the simple act of standing side by side. Love, Emily realized, wasn't about the promises made in excitement but about the ones kept in silence. And Luke, with his few words and steady heart, kept every one of them. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Emily watched Luke carrying their daughter on his shoulders. The sight made her heart swell with gratitude and wonder. She thought back to the night she had been left, broken and alone, and how life had led her here, to a love stronger than she had ever dared to hope for. Luke caught her gaze and gave one of his rare, soft smiles, and in that moment, she knew she was exactly where she belonged. She wasn't abandoned anymore. She was cherished, protected, and finally home. Years later, when their daughter was old enough to understand, Emily told her the story of how they became a family. She didn't dwell on the pain of the past but instead spoke of the strength it took to survive, the kindness of a man who said little but gave everything, and the love that grew from ashes. The little girl listened with wide eyes, holding both her mother's and father's hands tightly. And when the story ended, she whispered, "I'm glad he's my dad." Luke, true to form, said nothing, but the way he pulled her close said everything. Emily knew then that the most beautiful stories weren't the ones written in fairy tales, but the ones built from brokenness into hope. Her husband had left after the baby's first cry, but God had sent her someone far better, a man who didn't run from cries but answered them with love. And in his silence, she had found the loudest truth, that sometimes, the family you need most is the one you create from courage, kindness, and faith in second chances.